You can do some crazy shortcuts with a feather in Mario Kart World, but what would be possible if Nintendo added the double feather as an item? There are already triple versions of items like mushrooms and bananas, so it isn't out the realms of possibility for Nintendo to introduce it. For today's video, I found as many shortcuts as I could with help from some of my channel members that require 2 feathers, and some of them are pretty insane. On Mario Bros Circuit, there is a hidden rail on the building on the inside of the first turn, so if you do the charge jump onto the green rail, you could then use 2 feathers to get up to the top of the building, letting you take the turn tighter than normal. You can also use 2 feathers on the long right turn for a small gap cut, but sadly, Lack 2 prevents you from saving too much time with it, which is a fairly common occurrence when you're trying to do extreme shortcuts in this game. Whistle Stop Summit is probably the best track in the game to pull a feather on, with the gap cut saving a ridiculous amount of time when you take it with a feather, and the ending cut onto the final rail is made a lot easier when you have a feather too. A completely new shortcut would be possible with the double feather though, as you could switch from the bottom to the top path at the start of the lap, a faster and easier alternative to the rock cut, which is a deceptively difficult shortcut to pull off consistently. In contrast, Dandelion Depth is a track that a feather is practically useless on, but with a double feather you can do a couple of cool things. The first one is another path switch to take a tighter turn before the water section, the path you land on otherwise being entirely pointless, so it would be nice to have some sort of use for it. The second one is to take the final shortcut without getting stuck in the off-road, as you can jump incredibly high to give yourself enough time to turn towards the finish line before you land. Faraway Oasis is one of the best feather tracks in the game thanks to the final turn, but it isn't the most extravagant of shortcuts. However, with a double feather you can jump from the rail in the grass underneath the wooden platform and then fly all the way over the off-road, which all looks a lot more impressive than the single feather cut. Some of the uses of a double feather wouldn't just be crazy new shortcuts, it could also be to make an existing strategy a whole lot easier, which is the case for the final rail shortcut on Wario Stadium. Rather than contesting for the coin with 2 or 3 other players, just use 2 feathers to get onto the rail without any trouble. Another use of the item could also be to do a rail switch after the big shortcut early on, but I'm not sure how practical it would actually be in races. Either way, it is cool, so who cares? A double feather could also be used to combine multiple shortcuts in a row, which is a possibility on desert hills. If you had 2 feathers here at the final section, you can do the Shroomer's pole shortcut and then feather onto the right wall, landing on a rail that takes you to another rail below, which you can then jump off and use a second feather to get over all the grass and cross the finish line. Crown City has the craziest feather shortcut in the entire game, where you combine a charge jump, wall ride and pole trick to set yourself up for a feather to take you to the top of the rooftops on the next turn. This is all quite difficult to do, but with a double feather it is made a bit easier, as you just need to aim towards the buildings whilst on the road, then you should be able to get the distance and height you need. One of the most well-known feather shortcuts in the game is found on Guy Bazaar, where you take the left turn after the second item set and then feather onto the rail on the inside wall. This shortcut is great and all, but there's all this space next to the rail that would be faster to drive across rather than attaching to the rail. Well, with the double feather you can take advantage of the space if you time it right. If you go on the rail path beforehand and then aim to the right side of the water fountain, you can land in between the rail and the wall up top and drift around the turn, saving so much time over just going around. This is because you are practically driving in a straight line rather than taking the turns in an S-bend, covering a lot less distance. Surprisingly, Sky High Sunday has a couple of applications for the double feather, the first one being a simple off-road cut on the first turn, something that isn't really doable with a single feather for some reason. The other one is much better though, as you can use 2 feathers to jump across the gap rather than take the wall ride path at the end. To be honest, this is probably possible with only 1 feather if you have the correct alignment, but it's made completely free with 2 of them. In any shortcut video ever, I will always say that Airship Fortress only really has 1 shortcut, and with the double feather it is no different. You can take the final turn a bit tighter using a double feather, which isn't a big time save but still worth noting. Although on lap 3 you can take an even tighter turn over the void since you don't need to land back on the road, but if you fail it is an absolute nightmare. Now Wario Shipyard has a few feather shortcuts already, one of which is towards the end of the track where you go on the right path entering the ship and then jump onto the rail above, but it doesn't save all that much time because you have to take the previous turn wide in order to set it up. However, if you have a double feather you can make it up there from the regular left path, making it slightly more worth it. Now I did also think that this might have a similar strategy to the Shy Guy Bazaar cut, since there is once again some space next to the rail that looks faster to drive across. However, I then realised that Lack 2 is very strict here for some reason, limiting the amount of time you can actually save using this shortcut. Koopa Troopa Beach has a very obvious and simple double feather cut. Just use 2 feathers over the regular mushroom shortcut and you'll get over nearly all the off-road. Nothing special, but would be helpful in races for sure. The shortcut I found at the end of Salty Speedway is definitely not the fastest shortcut you can do, but it is pretty mental, so I wanted to include it anyway. You can use 2 feathers on the glider path to get all the way onto the rope above the final shortcut, so at least you wouldn't have to deal with all the chaotic items being used down there. Sadly, you are forced to jump off the rail after a few tricks, otherwise Lakitu picks you up, but the fact you can get up here at all is pretty crazy. On Starview Peak, there is a very difficult feather cut where you jump to the right of the big off-road patch and land on the rail, but of course if you have a double feather you can cover a lot more distance, making it a lot easier, faster, and of course much more impressive to watch. On Acorn Heights, the double feather gives you another option at the end of the track, as you can just jump across the entire gap without needing any rails. You simply drive off the edge and then bounce to the other side. Mario Circuit of course has the big shortcut at the beginning of section 2 that can sort of be done with a single feather, but if you have a double feather you can do a much more impressive version that gets you across all the off-road and even the wall on the inside to cut off the next small turn as well. Of course, you could also use a double feather towards the end of the track to do 2 feather shortcuts in a row, since there is quite a lot of time to be saved by jumping over some of the walls. Now, before we get into Rainbow Road, which has a few insane double feather strategies, a few of my channel members found some pretty interesting possibilities on intermission/route tracks, so I'm going to showcase a few here. On Drybone's Burnout to boost cinema, you can do an insane off-road skip. If you jump onto the rails holding up the bridge and then trick left at the end, you can wall ride on the cliff and then combine 2 feathers with a tree bounce to land on the road, cutting off the entire turn. On Cheap Falls to Faraway Oasis, you can combine 2 feathers with a bounce off a giraffe on the turn before the final lap, once again cutting off a lot of off-road. On Sky High Sunday to Wario Shipyard, you can use a double feather in the Vanilla Lake section to just jump across the middle of the whole thing, letting you go in a straight line rather than taking one of the turns either side. On Dandelion Depth to DK Pass, you can use 2 feathers to bounce off a flagpole, then land on a cabin roof, then jump onto another roof next to it, which then leads back onto the road. On Bowser's Castle to Wario Stadium, you can combine 2 feathers with 2 tree bouncers to cut off an off-road turn, with an extra trick off a stone barrier for some more speed as you land. On the first turn of Starview Peak to Sky High Sunday, there is a lot of off-road you can cut off, and since it is going downhill, you can cover a lot of distance with 2 feather bouncers. And finally, we have a strategy on Mario Bros Circuit to Wario Stadium that I heavily doubt is faster, but is pretty ridiculous, where you climb up the wall before the tunnel and then just drive on the road above as if you're in free roam. I do not understand why Lakitu doesn't interfere here, but I'm not complaining. I wish he was as lenient as this on some other tracks as well. Of course, there will be many more double feather shortcuts on these tracks, but for now let's head over to Rainbow Road, as there are quite a few strategies we found here. As I say, Lakitu is normally quite strict when it comes to how far to the side of a track you can go, but on this turn he changes his mind, because you can jump so far into the void and still make it back onto the track if you have 2 feather bouncers here. Soon afterwards, you can do a fast version of the path switch, where you just jump over this gap and avoid having to take either of the big turns. As you begin section 3, you can jump across another big gap to get onto the ramp in the middle of the off-road, because why not? Of course, if you had a double feather, you could do 2 of the feather cuts in the split path section in a row, which would definitely give you a big time save over everyone else taking the turns normally. Then finally, you can use 2 feathers to do a much safer variant of the big ending shortcut, so you wouldn't have to worry about getting bumped or trailed out by anyone when trying to do the wall ride. And that's it for today's video. Do you think the double feather should be added as an item? Let me know in the comments down below. If you could leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, it would be much appreciated, and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.